Planet Leave by Clifton B. Kruse. This story was only ever published in the March 1941 issue of Cosmic Stories. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Planet Leave. You Earthman, yes? Sundgren looked up from the dismantled section of a parsector upon which he had been working. His blue eyes widened with surprise. Before him stood a 7-foot-tall Brogite, one of the huge-headed natives of Planet 14, Aldebaran. Two jet-brilliant eyes stared unblinkingly at the blond Earthman, Nels Sundgren. The monster's jaws moved, showing a triple row of canine-like teeth. Shoma, the Brogite uttered with an incongruous softness of voice. Oxygen engineer. Have very much traveled and speak, no doubt, the very beautiful English. I see, Earthman. Yes? Right. Nels Sundgren nodded slowly. At the present moment, these two stood at the far end of the great Rocketeer's engine repair room, and save for the 3 or 4 small, black-bodied, 6-handed little Zannikins who were intent upon putting a repaired gravity simulator together, they were, for the time being, alone. Glad to know you, Shoma, but you gave me a start. Fact is, I hadn't heard a word of English since we left planet Ismusan. Also right. Shoma, nodding his gargantuan green head solemnly, looked almost like a giant frog. He wore the woven bronze mesh uniform of a commercial rocketeer service. Our 410 creatures, passengers and crew, now on board, and which represent 72 planets. You are only one from System of Sol, which is renowned for humans. I know you better. Sundgren, your name, yes? Impulsively, the Earthman grinned, stuck out a grease-stained hand, and gripped the 7-fingered appendage of the huge Brogite. All right, buddy, since we're shipmates and you speak English. Glory, it's something to hear a man's own language way out here. Very far from Earth, indeed, Shoma acknowledged. This system is Cluster Messier 13 in Hercules. You understand? We land on 17 planets before return trip back to Ismusan. You like Ismusan? No? Like it? Thunder, no! Sundgren laughed bitterly. The darkest, dirtiest, vermin-infested planet in the universe. I never did like an insect planet, and these blamed Ismusanians, Spider-Men is what I call them. Very much of truth. Shoma sucked in his breath noisily, indicating pleased agreement. On next voyage, think to sign up for long journey, clear away from Hercules system. I very good oxygen engineer, can get plenty contract. Sure, I know. Sundgren nodded. Never saw one of you Brogites who wasn't an expert at something. But I'm afraid I'm just a fool mechanic, Shoma. We've been shooting through Messier 13 now for 14 work shifts, and I haven't done a thing but repair one burned-out parsector after another, and no one to talk to. Very exact, Shoma spoke up. So why I approach you? Would Earthmen care for what you call very nice little hellbender at next planet stop? It is very exotic world called Uyiki. Uyiki? Sundgren scratched his head speculatively. The sway of the speeding Rocketeer's gyrators rolled the massive hull gently as fiery stabs of disintegrator exhaust shot outward into the black, star-flaring vista of space in the island universe of Messier 13. Millions of suns with several thousand planets made this great star cluster one of the most active in all the list of interplanetary rocketeering. No less than 400 spaceship routes, officered by beings from hundreds of life-spawning worlds, plied here and there in ceaseless trade. There were men from Earth, Brogites from the fourth Antares planet, live, jet-black Xanakins from the massive lone planet of Formalhaut, and still others, strange beings with one love in common, that of hurtling across space in the gigantic trade rockets of the universe, were to be found in every spaceport ready to sign up for another voyage with any crew and bound for anywhere. Nels Sundgren, Earth, was one of these. He alone represented the distant system of Sol on this present trip, and until the giant Brogite, Shoma, introduced himself, he had not heard a word of his native tongue for many months of almost forgotten Earth time. "Never heard of Uyaki," Sundgren muttered. "This is the first time, though, that I've been within 100 parsecs of this space area. Anyway, Shoma, I'm with you. I've got 40 checks of Ra to spend." "No monies," Shoma protested. "Shoma know Uyaki very well. You come along only. I show you. Uyaki very much amusing place." At that moment, ship bells rang out, causing the big Brogite to bid hasty goodbye to his newfound Earthman friend. "Work shift signal as you say it." Shoma bowed his ungainly head politely. "We'll see again when all oxygen breathers land for Uyaki halfway through next shift." Sundgren waved cheerfully. There was an adventure-hopeful glint to his hard blue eyes as he returned to the monotonous details of rewinding the damaged parsector. He'd met Brogites before, liked the ugly beasts for all their revolting appearance in an Earthman's eyes. Brogites were invariably gentle and stubbornly loyal, too. Sundgren puckered his unshaven jaw into a whistle. Not such a bad contract this time, after all. Uyaki? Funny name. Might be a lot of fun there, too, with Shoma the Brogite as guide. Just then, a shrill blast of unintelligible invective lashed in his direction. The Xanakins were dancing about on their spindly, chitinous legs, hissing at him in the peculiar rage of their kind. "Sorry," Sundgren grumbled and stopped his whistling. "Should have known you jumpy black imps of Formalhaut couldn't stand the noise. Oh well." Lower airlock resounded with a hushed discord of sound. The pungency, peculiar to the commingling of so many and different life forms, rankled in the nostrils of the lone Earthman. He stared at the bizarre assembly of beings of all colors, shapes, and sizes, reptilian, insect, and some remotely mammalian, without actually seeing them. The single-eyed octoped, wearing the insignia of a commanding officer, waved antennae feverishly as he manipulated the intra-ship communicator, which flashed a series of orders in 14 languages. Every spaceman must have at least 2 secondary languages. Sundgren searched the big chart on the wall and found he could decipher 3 of the 14 interpretations, none of which even remotely resembled anything spoken upon Earth. The big airlock portals were swinging back now. The commanders were giving the oxygen breathers a long rest here on Uyaki. Sundgren found himself tensing with excited expectancy. Stepping out upon a totally strange planet was invariably a thrill. It was this anticipation alone which made hopeless wanderers of so many. Suddenly, a heavy paw clapped his shoulder. Sundgren jumped, looking around and up into the fearsome face of the Brogite. "Good oxygen plenty," Shoma muttered. "Others go to spaceport for drink and such. You come other place better, yes?" "Any place you say, pal." And Sundgren pushed forward with the surging pack, keeping contact with the huge-bodied Brogite. They were going beyond the ship now, scurrying down the ramp to the brownish soil. Sundgren stared about with slowly awakening interest. Two tiny suns illumined a dull purplish-gray world whose peculiar aromatic atmosphere tickled his throat and lungs. Some of the other creatures from the massive rocketeer were finding the murky air a painful shock. There were rasping cries, sharp coughs. One pulpous, mottled green and gold slug-like being slumped into an inert heap even before reaching the soil of the new planet. Sundgren regarded this unfortunate shipmate with callous indifference. He didn't know what sort of a creature the green and gold slug was, nor what sort of a world his kind might inhabit. At a distance there stood a cluster of curious buildings, seeming to spring up in the purplish haze like a bed of poisonous mushrooms. That would be Uyaki Spaceport, and it was in this direction that most of the bizarre crew trekked. But Shoma, clutching Sundgren's arm, led him off in another direction. Vaguely, Sundgren recognized this as a meandering path, winding almost haphazardly through a dark forest of grotesque, giant-leaved trees. The stinging, spicy smell became cloying. Sundgren held firmly to Shoma's arms, feeling oddly giddy. "Feel of planet gets you," Shoma explained needlessly. "Always such wherever land. All worlds have each one a different feel. Is not so?" "No argument there," Sundgren grumbled. "But where in Hades you taking me? We should have stopped at Spaceport first anyway. Give me a mug of Creel or two and I can take on anything." "No Creel," Shoma intoned pleasantly. "No drink like Creel. Any on Ujiki. You see why later. Very amusing world, Ujiki." "Huh? What's it good for?" The Earthman tried to stare through the haze. He drew his breath sparingly, aware of the spicy burning in his throat, which had become even more aggravating with Shoma's assurance that no beverages of any sort were used by the Uyiki natives. Already he had begun to regret this hurried friendship with the green monster of Aldebaran, despite the Brogite engineer's knowledge of English. "Here so soon," Shoma murmured, and guided Sundgren sharply to the left. "Uyikin City down here. Back there, just another company spaceport. But here is real Uyiki." Nels Sundgren gasped. They were standing on the very edge of a precipice and looking down upon a vast city of spiraled towers. He understood now that the interplanetary spaceport must be situated upon a huge plateau. As he stared more intently, he could make out a constant bubbling of hundreds of shimmering balloons rising from the depths to glide here and there about the curious towers. "But how do we get down there?" Sundgren demanded. "And besides, much patience plus wisdom of the Brogites," Shoma replied, bobbing his grotesque head to show the gentility of his levity. "Uyiki planet, you know, is great with universe fame for rare perfumes. But watch, friend Earthman." Shoma had withdrawn a compact little case containing a score of tightly corked vials. For a moment, one huge eye closed speculatively as he fingered them in order to select the one suited for his present purpose. Carefully removing the cork, Shoma wafted the opened vial before them. Nels Sundgren stared at the massive green brogite with opened mouth. "They come! See!" Shoma pointed downward toward the tower city in the purple valley. Straight toward them now came sailing an entire fleet of the scintillating balloons. Sundgren groaned a curse, instinctively bracing himself and resting a hand on the brogite. "Those balls! They're alive! They got hair on one end and feet? Why, they're birds!" "Right!" Shoma exulted as he quickly replaced the vial, substituting it for still another. "Almost so. Should I correct you, Earthmen? Uyikin's very marvelous to smell." "You mean that bottle of stuff?" "Assuring." Shoma sucked in his breath sharply. "They smell of a fine keenness. But now only watch and do as told. We will visit Uyiki such as back in spaceport they cannot know them." "Well," Sundgren muttered in confusion, "you've been here before. But I might have known this was a screwy world, or there'd be at least one Uyikin spaceman aboard a liner that made a regular stop here." But the green brogite was not listening. Deftly uncorking the second vial, he gestured with it significantly. Immediately, the two were surrounded by the curious balls. As the singular creatures settled to the ground upon the tiny feet, Sundgren observed that they were nearly as tall as the big brogite, yet there was no face, no eyes, nor mouth. Only a tuft of wiry hair at the opposite diameter of the spherical body from the tiny feet. The shimmering bodies were subtly pulsating, with some curious system of metabolism beyond the imagination of even such a wanderer of the void as Nels Sundgren. But what was the brogite doing with that silly-looking box of vials? And how did the big green monster think to communicate with this flock of animated soap bubbles? However, before he could question Shoma, the bulbous Uyikis suddenly converged into a single mass. Shoma quickly lifted the astounded Earthman bodily, placing him atop the cushioning mass, and then clambered up beside him. At once they began floating down. The sharp hiss of escaping air was the only sound made. "Very fine, no?" Shoma spread his great arms in a gesture to include the entire valley. "See, up! Spaceport on mountain." Sundgren looked back up. The cliffside rose a sheer 1,000 feet or more from the topmost spire, and in the hazy atmosphere there was no sign of a roadway by which they might return. Abruptly, the descent was halted. They were standing in a sort of public square about which rose the strange towers, like gaunt, unadorned pillars about which spiral ramps had been attached. Here and there, tiny holes opened into a tower, but nowhere was there an aperture anywhere near wide enough to admit a portly bladder being. The air down here, though markedly clearer, was heavy with a musty stench which was far less acceptable than the spicy aroma of the higher altitude. "Must be quick." Shoma's voice was lowered. "These people very dogged. Want more that fine smell." "You mean the odor from those bottles attracted them? Is that why they carried us down here?" "Sharply pertinent, Earthman," Shoma continued. "Now must lose bladder being. I run, you follow. Much fun. See?" Shoma was surprisingly agile. He seemed to be heading straight toward the center of this queer tower city, while behind them, evidently bewildered, the living spheres bobbled up and down in a desperate but futile effort to catch the strange intruders. Sundgren was relieved to note that the Uyakin bladder beings could move about the surface only with difficulty. It was also clear that they had but a limited amount of intelligence. But Shoma had evidently arrived at his goal. He was examining each tower intently, finally coming upon one which possessed an opening large enough to admit his body. Inside was a large circular room, moist and rich with a honeyed fragrance. Sundgren blinked, adjusting his eyes to the soft light which seemed to emanate from the shell-like stuff of the walls. They were in the middle of a lush growth of velvet-soft plant-like bodies. Long and narrow leaves extended from squat bushes. Upon a flower-like stalk in the center of each bush there grew a curiously mottled ball. Shoma was snapping the stems and biting into the strange balls avidly, pausing only long enough to motion that the Earthman was to do the same. Sundgren hesitated only a moment. After the first bite, he felt a tingling sense of elation. He grinned knowingly. Hadn't he always known these big ugly Brogites were smart? A dinner of this crazy fruit, and they'd both have a jag on that would lay them out for the next 10 parsecs. Finally, Shoma stopped him. "So much," the Brogite warned. "Go to head, quick. Very fine, no?" "Never heard of such stuff," Sundgren agreed. "But how is it there was no mention of it on the ship? Why, if these dodos were halfway smart, they'd clean up a journey's wages selling—" No, Uyiki, very upset. Come." Reluctantly, the Earthman followed the Brogite. Nels Sundgren was just beginning to feel expansive. The spaceship and duty were remote realities. This was a beautiful, if somber, world. Outside again, the two ran swiftly. Sundgren was panting in his effort to keep up with Shoma. There was something amiss, too, because Shoma was taking precautions to avoid the Uyakins. "Very upset," Shoma finally explained. "Uyakins grow bush in towers. Rich smell exude through holes and are breathed by Uyakins for life stuff. No drink, no eat, only smell. See?" "You mean all these puffballs do is smell?" "Right. Puff is full of air which goes in and comes out of bladder skin. Such explains clearness of air down here." "I see," Sundgren mumbled. "But what are we running for?" "Uyakin smell us, smell flower stuff from breath. Earthmen, run!" Sundgren glanced up as the Brogite yelled. To his terror, he saw the sky suddenly fill with hundreds of the queer bladder beings. His own mouth gaped to shriek out, yet before the sound could escape, his throat, a mass of rubbery stuff, pressed down upon him. Sundgren struck blindly. It was like fighting a milling, choking mass of balloons. The soft, rubbery stuff slid over his hands and face and seemingly tried to strangle him by clamping over his nose and mouth. The air was sucked out of his lungs. A burning pain throbbed in his chest. He gasped, choked, and finally pried 2 fingers between the smothering bladder and his mouth. He sucked madly for air. His ears were ringing now. He wanted to cry out to Shoma, but could do no more than moan as he exhaled. Yet he could breathe now. Sanity returned. He groped to his feet, pushing and stabbing at the bulbous masses. His one thought was to get away. Striking out with the one hand, he kicked viciously at the pressing bladders, gaining a tiny clearance. Like one possessed, he hurled himself forward. His charging body caused the near-weightless bladder beings to bound like huge balloons. Once he fancied he heard Shoma's cry and plowed on determinedly in what he thought was the direction of the sound. Then suddenly he found himself amidst dense, low-growing shrubbery. For a moment, the bouncing, surging bladder beings were at a disadvantage. Sundgren threw himself into the shrub, clawing and running until his muscles, accustomed for so long to the gentle, artificial gravity of a rocketeer, ached almost beyond endurance. He had eluded the bladder beings. They could not very well penetrate the dark, musty shrub area, he concluded. Sundgren, wiping the sweat from his face, stood up cautiously, straining his ears for the slightest sound in this deathly quiet world. His voice seemed thunderous as he shouted Shoma's name. Not until he had shouted several times and received no reply did he begin to become uneasy. This was a strangely soundless world, without voice or even the chirp of an insect. Shoma should have heard. A sharp sting of fear got him now. Perhaps the big Brogite hadn't been as lucky as the Earthman. Shoma might have been smothered by those aroma-crazed bladder beings. Sundgren stalked cautiously in what he thought was the direction of the queer bladder being's city, keeping well in the protective shelter of the low-growing shrub. Once he glanced skyward and was distressed to see but one sun in that purplish-black sky. He called again. The shrubbery suddenly merged into a grove of tree-like growths whose tall, whitish stalks were barren of limbs for 30 feet. There they formed a profusion of clustering flower masses. A heady, nauseating odor pervaded the dark, ominously still cavern of tree trunks. Nels Sundgren halted. He was lost and recognized the fact without a great deal of panic. He had spent too many days and nights upon distant, eerie worlds to be easily frightened, yet he did feel a sharp pang of concern for the big Brogite. Shoma, he was thinking, was a wonderfully intelligent friend and above all else spoke English. That was something. Vaguely, Sundgren was aware of a half-formed decision to sign up for a soul-bound liner upon the very next opportunity. It wasn't that he cared particularly for the company of men. He knew a dozen different creatures just as companionable, but the good, wholesome sound of English words. Suddenly Sundgren let out a cry. Something like the lash of a whip had stunned him sharply on the forehead. Sundgren jumped back, one fist clenched and the other lifted defensively before his face. In the purplish gloom, he saw the huge, spinous bush whose long, sensitive stalks quivered like the antennae upon a monster ant-man of the 4th Centauri planet. But this was just a bush. Sundgren grinned with relief and approached it with the idea of tearing off a good-sized stick to use as a poke against the bladder beings. Yet, as soon as his hand gripped a stalk, the entire plant quivered. There came a sudden, sharp poof. Sundgren drew back, closing his eyes tight against the stinging vapor. The nauseous stench momentarily sickened him. He was gasping for breath, clearing his throat and trying vainly to spit out the offensive taste. But now the tree-like growths were becoming strangely activated. The flexible trunks swept down and the flower masses swept over him, slimy tendrils clutching tight to hair, skin, and clothing. Tearing at the succulent growths which suddenly fought to smother him, the terrified Earthman struggled away from the scent-maddened trees. His face felt raw. Trickles of blood formed beneath clutching tendrils. Again and again he ripped the flower masses away from his face. Weak and panting for breath, he scrambled down among the shrubs again. The madness of Uyiki was beyond all reasoning. It seemed that the entire planet lived upon odors, was moved to action by certain smells. Now, and possibly too late, he understood that case of vials which Shoma had brought along. With smells, you could do anything here on Uyiki, but you had to have the right smells. Sundgren laughed aloud, A little madly, he recognized, as his voice reverberated in his ears against that awful soundlessness of this queer world. Shoma? He mumbled aloud. He must find Shoma. The darkness of the weird Uyakin night was broken by the ruddy glow of a huge moon. Long, ominously silent shadows stretched over the valley. The Earthmen, creeping forward cautiously, fought the fatigue of combined nervous shock and hunger. The exhilarating effect of the bulb fruit from the bladder being's towers had worn off. Far ahead of him, doubtlessly several miles distant, he could see the sharp outline of the mountain plateau. But in between was the tower city of the bladder beings. There was, so far as he knew, no way to climb up that steep precipice. Besides, he could not return without the Brogite. The loyalty of culture was as real as the instinctive loyalty of race. Shoma was certainly not a man, and yet the huge green monster was undeniably something possessing the status and the dignity of a human being. Shoma! He called again, standing erect and keeping an alert eye for either bladder beings or some strange growth which might find his odorous person irresistible. There came the faint rustle of a footfall somewhere in the darkness behind him. Sundgren tensed. His voice became low-pitched, defiantly firm. Shoma, is that you? There were other padding, rustling, almost feathery sounds now. The Earthman steeled his nerves as he strained to peer into the gloom. His brain functioned with remarkable clarity. Was not Uyaki supposed to be virtually without animal life? He was sure now that Shoma had said as much, or at any rate the Brogite had implied that the bladder beings were the dominant life form here. Possibly this was a search party from the spaceship come to locate the two oxygen breathers who had failed to appear at the company recreation building. But this was unlikely. Upon such planets as Uyaki, they never checked up until ship bells sound prior to takeoff. Sundgren raised his voice. He racked his brain for greetings in every language he knew, hissed the Ismusan for "Who goes there?" tried the widely known clacking sounds of the slug-like creatures from the blue planet of the Tri-Sun system in Messier 13. This was the official language of the company for which he now worked, but there was no response save the increased pad and scrape of invisible feet. He started to back away from the sounds. Then something entangled his legs. Sundgren pitched headlong, flailing his arms. Yet he couldn't get up. Long, rope-like things twisted about his body, wrapping tightly around his arms and legs. Bird-like claws scratched and tightened upon his mesh metal service uniform. Blind with terror, Sundgren twisted, turned, heaved his body. The bands, like sleek, muscular tentacles, only grew more taut. He felt the brush of stiff, wiry masses of hair sweep across his face. He was moving now. Only inches above the ground, he felt his body being moved forward as though borne by 100 dwarfish things of prodigious strength. A sickeningly sweet odor filled his gasping lungs, but he could see a little. The roseate moonlight was falling full upon a clearing. Sundgren summoned all his strength, lifting his head barely an inch. The ludicrous spectacle made his body chill with horror. Queer, rope-like things with tiny feet on one end and stiff metallic tufts of hair on the other were wrapped about him till he could not move. But those feet and the tufts of hair! Involuntarily he cried out. The bladder beings, completely deflated, had stolen upon him in the darkness. Their bulbous bodies, now stretched into the rubbery likeness of an empty balloon, were wound about him. The underpart of his prone body seemed alive with masses of tiny feet which marched steadily along with the perfect rhythm of a single entity. He saw the Tower City. They were approaching an immense building. There were none of the exotic plants growing in the great circular hall. Sundgren felt himself moved to the spot near the center. He waited expectantly. Would the deflated beings unwind themselves now? Curiously, they had halted. Suddenly he saw a coiled bladder mass approaching. The stiff tuft of hair quivered. The creature suddenly stiffened upon its absurdly tiny feet, and then the flat bladder shot upward like a striking snake. There came the hissing rush of air in regular pulsations as the bladder being puffed itself into a giant living sphere. Sundgren tried to squirm away from the oval smoothness of that shimmering ball. The horror of choking film charged his muscles with renewed fury. But the inflated monster had bounded back. From those quick, excited pulsations of the body, Sundgren knew that something was wrong. The bladder being was obviously bewildered. Now the thing bent over. The brush-like tuft of hair quivered as it barely touched the Earthman's scratched and bleeding face. Again the thing retreated. It seemed to be issuing forth some soundless cry to those which held the prisoner, for almost immediately the bands of deflated bladder were loosened. Sundgren groped to his feet dazedly. The bladdermen sprang up about him, and the chamber became for the moment shrill with their pulsating intakes of air. Nels Sundgren thought swiftly. Something about him had suddenly nauseated the aroma-sensitive bladder beings. It was either the essence from the strange, spinous bush, or else— he laughed softly at the thought— or else it was the smell of human blood. With reckless desperation, he rubbed one hand across his bleeding face and quickly smeared the nearest bladder. The being jumped, its heaving sides sending out sharp, quivering whistles of air. Instantly there came a rush of air as the other beings deflated and hastily scurried from the room. Nels Sundgren shouted with the ferocious triumph of a conquering Viking, his blue eyes flashing and his blond hair standing awry upon his head. Then the cry died out sharply. Sundgren held his breath, listened. That shout of defiance had aroused another voice. The Earthman rushed to an opening, staring here and there in the dim, moonlit night. "Shoma!" he screamed. "Here!" a voice returned from a tower near the very edge of the city. "My Earth friend, to you it is greetings." There followed a babble in the speech of the Brogites, which, despite the fact he could not understand one word of it, Nels Sundgren knew to be a song of hilarity. He squirmed through a narrow hole into the distant tower. A momentary flash of angry resentment coursed through his stout body, for there, lying amid the crushed bushes of the precious nectar bulbs, was the gigantic green hulk of Shoma the Brogite. "You drunken green ape!" Sundgren charged forward, but being no match for the Brogite giant, the scuffle was soon ended. Now Shoma stumbled awkwardly to his feet. "Earthman," the huge monster's voice was ridiculously plaintive. "So sorry. Thought to escape. Hide in here to await going away of bladder beings." He waved his paws about. "Like I warned. Too much. Eat too much. Go happy in head. Forget. But now will forgive." For an instant, Sundgren glared into those huge, unblinking eyes. Then the Earthman grinned understandingly. "Can we get back?" "Can." Shoma's gargantuan jaw gaped joyously at the forgiveness. Jubilantly, he displayed his case of vials. "Smell crazy beings will take. Go back now. First, Shoma must drink. So. He swallowed the contents of one of the vials, grimaced. Breath very not pleasant. Understand? Now can go, but hold. Must take off blood smell Earthman's face. Blood smell scare bladders. I fix. Nels Sundgren held his breath while the cluster of eager bladder beings, obeying some powerful scent, speedily lifted the two intruders to the ledge. Again, Shoma took out a vial, uncorked it, and with a gesture of generosity sprinkled it upon the milling balloon masses. Farewell, puffies, he sighed, still obviously elated by the quantity of bulbs he had eaten. Then, throwing a great green arm about the Earthmen, he pointed into the misty distance. Very fine fun, yes? We go on fine bender again. Come to Oxygen Planet. Someday, Earthmen, I think to go to Sol System. Sign up for big contract. Go to Earth. Maybe go to place called New York. What think, Earthmen? Oh, sure, Sundgren answered absent-mindedly. But this next Oxygen Planet stop, what sort of a place is it, Shoma? You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.